Good morning, at least this morning for me. It is the Daily World Walk, episode 4. And I'm not going to refresh us all on previously on because it's a daily show where I world build as I walk around this beautiful Arboretum or wherever I happen to be. And I upload it the same day, so if you have any suggestions or ideas, let me know. This show goes up simultaneously on Patreon and Libsyn. It's both free, both places. Distributed to all those podcatchers. But anyway, I'm here to world build. So, last time we were at the Sea of Tranquility, and we're still going to continue with this Sea of Tranquility flame rift situation. I forget what we actually called the volcanic land, so I'm calling it the flame rift right now. This is the problem with not writing things down while world building, of course. But we have two main non-human species and humans in this fantasy setting. We've got the foragers and their operators the operators that operate their machines, which are the operators being supernatural creatures like angels or demons that can possess or control machinery that's keyed to them. And that's what these foragers build to send out as their envoys. And I think this is all, and the packs are these sea creatures that sea people, really. They're like dolphin, bird kind of creature. And I think some of them, maybe there's a subspecies of them that can fly. I don't know if we want to go that far, but I like the idea that, or maybe they can fly and fish it. Kind of like the idea. Let's say the packs can probably glide. At least if they're trained well enough and get strong enough, they can probably do some gliding over the water or jump out of the water and glide, or, they're amphibious, not aquatic, so they can leave the water. Maybe they just go up on a cliff and fly out over to wherever. But regardless, this is our kind of foundation, right? And I'm not sure what the technology level in this setting is like exactly, but I think it's relatively low, except for the foragers. So the foragers are using the immense amount of geothermal type energy that they have to make what they do, and not only sustain their physiologies because they are reptiles, but to make the machines work more easily and to forge new machines for the operators to control and service their missionaries and envoys. So the more I'm thinking about it, the more I think the foragers probably do more or less control rather than worship their angels. Perhaps there's a greater being that they do worship, and the ones that dispatch these angels across the world, these machines with spirits inside them. So, okay, this is where we're at. And I think it's about time we started putting in some characters. I mean, you might not associate characters with world building necessarily, but, I used to feel the same way, and I'm just going to explain my rationale here, because it used to feel to me that a world with systems, like we've been talking about, systems and types, things that are bigger than individuals. But if you look at the world now, there's a lot of individuals that have a lot of power, and that's always been kind of the case, right? There's always been kings and stuff like that, people like that, who shake the world, and they move it around, and they can change things because they've accumulated so much power and authority and whatever, or fame, frankly. But I think we might be on the verge of being able to start deciding who's the big dogs in this setting, right? Out of our 4 types of people, we haven't really talked about humanity much. I'm thinking humanity is not to be too dismissive of the kind of lower tech fantasy tropes like Dark Age or Middle Ages, or even Renaissance. I think probably Renaissance makes most sense. Maybe even late Renaissance. So we're talking possibly hand cannons, pikes, great swords for war, heavily armored cavalry possibly. And and we're talking fairly advanced sailing vessels, but not steam vessels. So there's a lot there we can play with. I think probably the ship technology is the most advanced in this area, though. And with the intervention of forger technology, I think there probably are steam vessels, actually. Just to go back on what I just said, there's at the very least some kind of way to move a ship without the wind. Possibly, depending on the weight of this technology, it could be a backup or it could be a whole other kind of vessel. So you might have sails and an engine, but that's probably unlikely. Excuse me. I think it makes the most sense that we're dealing with, okay, so we have this like basic human, semi-pseudo-historical kind of mindset here of a set of cultures to the east and the south that are, I guess, predominantly agrarian with powerful class systems in place, possibly. I don't know, let's just say that. I know humans are not an afterthought. They're actually usually the main people in my settings these days. Go figure, a human writing humans, right? But that's typical for fantasy. But these the humans of this setting so far have, this is the mistake of not having character in some sense. Because figuring out who these other peoples are, these other species, is kind of a base level, but then if you stop there, you end up with a flanderized, to use the Simpsons term, right? Where the characters, but in the context of a setting, it means that every character from a setting behaves the same way. It's like the Klingon effect or whatever from some parts of Star Trek. Not all parts, obviously, so it's kind of a weird one to reference, but, like all Klingons are fighters or warriors or whatever. That kind of thing. But yeah, I think we're going to start off with what kind of characters rule this or govern humanity. I kind of like the idea of our humans not being monarchists or not having monarchical systems because for whatever reason, obviously I'm an American, but it rubs me the wrong way. Even though, obviously, historically, there's a lot of precedent for that. There's also precedent for democracies, republics, other systems too, communes. And actually, I kind of like the idea of let's just focus predominantly on the trading partners of the packs and the forgers, because they're the ones we were operating on this big, shallow sea of tranquility. And I think that there are probably lots of resources there. Shallow water, lots of water, in fact. Lots of fresh water, arable land probably nearby. Even though, I'm going to say, maybe to the east, this land is predominantly swamp for quite a while, so maybe there's less advantage there. But to the south, there's these vast plains of arable land that are just a little higher than the water level, really. At least relatively speaking. And this is where humanity kind of develops in this context, in this setting. And we're talking a land of plenty. Well, let's just say it's a land of plenty. There's a lot there. And I think the mineral resources are relatively poor, though. So that motivates them to keep moving everywhere else as they develop technology, and probably develop technology a little faster because the forgers are pretty close by in some areas, or ranging far and wide. So the humans, and in where they meet the water, probably the humans and the packs are more or less, I like the idea of them having a shared society there, at least in those nations or cultures. So we'll just go with it. And see, that's one thing about world building. Is like you'll probably hear me say this a lot. I'll say I feel like this is a good way to try it, or this is what I want. And that is really important in world building. I'm sorry to get into the weeds here, maybe, but what you want is important. What you try to do and your goals in making a setting have to come from somewhere, right? And they come from inside you. To get too philosophical about it. Anyway, the basic gist of world building, a campaign setting, or especially a fiction, is that it kind of reflects not necessarily a world you would want to live in, but a world you think is interesting, has conflict and elements you want to see in a story, whatever kind of story you're making, or whatever kind of purpose you have your world for. And we talked yesterday about intentions, If you want angels and demons to be a prominent part of a setting, you have to put them in somewhere. And that sounds really obvious and tautological, but some people will forget it, Some people will forget that you need to include the things you need, and you make them important by the absence or presence of other things that support or don't get in their way as a result. So, I think this setting does need a stronger direction. So I kind of think maybe we'll go with like a religious syncretism. So let's think more about the religions or supernatural entities that exist in these different, that are in common. Because we have established, I think, that, at least I think it would be cool to say that the world of the living, of the mortals, is completely different from the world beyond. And so there's not like operators that are forgers or packs or human. The operators are operators, and they can reach out to any of these species, which I think is really neat. Keeps it from being, factionalized on direct levels. And in fact, it's how these different cultures and species interact with the operators that I want to be kind of our central theme. Because we know that the forgers interact by helping them get bodies, basically. We move them into physical shells, or at least have them remote control physical shells. And then humans probably interact with the kind of operator that I think, maybe humans and packs are kind of similar in this regard, because they're both kind of more ordinary species in the sense of being mammals that don't have insane heat tolerance. So they interact with these operators by, I think, a couple ways. And I think one of them is basically magical willing possession, or channeling, I guess you might say. So these operators can be partnered with a human, and possibly there's some restrictions on it. Maybe they have to start when they're very young, or all the typical magic system things. Maybe they have to be very young, or even promised to the operator for a lifetime, which I kind of like that, but I've played with that in other settings. But maybe that's actually how it is. It's like a dedication, a ceremony that puts some kind of mark or modification to the body that lets the operator enter the mind and co-work. We'll work alongside the human and provide them their powers. I think that's kind of fun. So that gives us some options there. So now we kind of have the magic system. So let's get back to characters, right? I got diverted from that. Characters. I think now we have a magic system that is tied intrinsically to religion. We should think about religious leaders. I do think religious movements are important. But what kind of leaders do we want, right? That's kind of where do we want this to end up? So we can work backwards. It's kind of a big part of world building, right? What do we want to see in the present of this story world? And I kind of think, there's a couple big possibilities, right, from our world that are pretty obvious. There's the more, Buddhist, maybe even Hindu. I'm not as familiar with Hindu traditions of how the religion actually works, but they have priests and stuff. Anyway, but monks and ascetics and students and masters and that kind of thing. More Eastern tradition versus a tradition of, inherited schooling or whatever, like in the West, inheritance or schooling, basically. Those are the two things. I think disciplic succession is more of what I think of as an Eastern tradition, as far as religious tradition, and spirituality, wherein teachers pass down their knowledge to disciples, who then continue that chain. And then the other one is, the other two rather, are, power, passing down through bloodlines or other inheritance methods. Not necessarily genetic, right? It could be legal, which I think is kind of interesting. Legal or ritualistic. Religious ritual could be the key. Anyway, so we're looking at this kind of vibe, and then there's the last one, which I think is, or it's not necessarily the last one, it's the last one that's on my mind, which is the more you buy it, or it chooses you. There's a lot of options with magic and religious things, but we can think of that more as the prophetic, right? The inherited, the prophetic, the disciplic succession. These are all ways we can have a tradition of religion. And prophetic means kind of people say their own stuff. They come out speaking for their truth, and then that forms traditions and religions and so on. And obviously all these things are probably going to interact. But which one do we think is dominant among humans? Often I would roll a die at this point. I'd be like, okay, 1d3, 6-sided die. 1 or 2 is, disciplic succession. 3 or 4, you get the idea. But I'm not doing that right now. Don't have any dice in front of me. So I think we're going to go with, I started disciplic succession, so I don't want to go back there necessarily. I think I kind of like the idea of the legal inheritance, of there being contracts with possibly bloodlines, possibly just inherited, Okay, so this is like a deal with the devil kind of thing, except they're not necessarily demons or devils. But you sign your bloodline or your inheritors to gain the power of the operators, and that's how it actually works. So you write the terms. I think that's really neat, actually. You have to write the terms or get some extra to help you write the terms of a deal with an operator. And then that can subsist for multiple generations, possibly. Or exist for multiple generations or be renegotiated, that kind of stuff. I think that's really fun. As our human and pax kind of tradition. So this is more legal than bureaucratic than it is religious even. And I think that's really fun because, that's like the divine bureaucracy from China or something. But let's not take all the vibes from there. I like the idea of it being more like, I don't know, we're in the southern part of a shallow sea, so what do you think about Greece or Egypt on the borderland of the big Sea of Tranquility? Interesting. I kind of like that. I think we'll go with maybe a Greco-Roman vibe as a basis but obviously advanced to Renaissance period, so it's not even really that different from other European nations at this point. We're not talking hoplites. But they have a long tradition of wielding pikes. And maybe they even still use sculpted armor that, looks like a ripped dude or whatever. It's kind of a fun idea. Even though they also have guns and heavy knights and stuff. That's kind of fun. I like it. So let's go with that. It's kind of a Greek. To me, it's this Greek but carried forward. And then there's legal tradition. So there's a lot of... It's magic as law, or law as magic. Where you make a deal, and maybe certain people deal to only gain part of the operators' powers, because I imagine they have magical abilities. This is our main magic system probably at this point, which I think is fun. A contract that then you have to do certain things to maintain your relationship with your operator, or your operator has been swindled and you have more power than you should. There's a lot of room for dynamic there, and also it encourages a position where, like, if you can have a legal, authority or somebody who's good at logic, right? And we're talking, it just reminds me of ancient Greece again. Some philosopher or some logician who can write you a really, really good contract that kind of fools or gets more than it might seem from your operator in question. And it's pretty fun. And I think that let's lean toward the law side and the more modern vibe, honestly. More like revolutionary, Revolutionary War period or later America, where lawyers make the country, or lawyers have all this power. But I also like the idea that the lawyers frequently don't actually wield the physical power. They wield the magic by virtue of helping other people get more or less of it. And I think that's really exciting, because it provides a dynamic where people aren't necessarily strong fighters themselves or strong magic users, can influence the world. And that'll give us some archetypes to build characters from, right? We got our legal scholars, our lawyers. We have our mages. I think mages might also be warriors. I like that idea too. Mages and warriors, people who gain power from their operators and the contract that they sign with them. And then we probably have the old money, right? And so the old money could be either or both. And I think that's really exciting. I think maybe I'll write some notes down before tomorrow to solidify what I got. I'll be back then. I'll relate to you what I got for this setting, which is still the Sea of Tranquility, but notice how fast it's developed, right? Only about 2 hours, less than 2 hours, and look at that. A big old setting, one that has lots of depth possibly to explore, obviously. I mean, I haven't gotten into the depths yet. Everything you've heard is all I've thought about this setting, pretty much. Can't promise I didn't have some sneaky background thoughts, because that's a big part of creativity as well. But yeah, I'm Tim Nita Writer. My books are under my name, and you can find me at timnitawriter.com. The podcast is available for free through the Alive After Reading feed, and for now anyway. Thanks for listening, and I will talk to you tomorrow.